Good evening. Reading to you from Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground, and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and his body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. Then I desired to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth, and that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones. He shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey them. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart." This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good evening, everybody. Please keep your Bibles open. They're in Daniel chapter 7. We'll only be looking at verses 1 to 14 this evening. I'm not sure whether I can touch that or not. Well, we live in times that are full of terrifying news, aren't they? Uncertain times, news that creates anxiety. Because our news feeds are full of war, they're full of destruction, of human suffering. Think of places like Gaza, the Ukraine, Somalia, Sudan, and we could carry on for probably 5 minutes just listing areas where there are wars in the world. And as Christians, we're not immune to the anxieties of this world. We're not immune to facing the pressures and the struggles of this world. But we have a wonderful resource, and I believe the Ascension gives us one of those resources. So often we don't know what to do with the Ascension. Yes, we affirm the fact in the Creed that Jesus ascended back to heaven. But what does it mean for us in the here and now? Well, this first section of Daniel chapter 7 gives us some explanation of that. Now, as we come to Daniel chapter 7, we move into dangerous territory because we move from the historical section of the book of Daniel into the prophetic section. And you'll find many different interpretations as you read different readers on this. And this evening, we're not going to go into all the detail that's here. We're going to look at the big picture and hopefully be encouraged by it. And that's what you do when you come to prophetic writings, when you come to apocalyptic writings. I actually managed to say the word. It's like when you approach a painting. When you approach a painting, you look at the big picture first, don't you? You look at the whole painting, you take the whole painting in, and then later on you focus maybe on different sections of the painting, and then later on, if you're even interested, you may start looking at the different brush strokes, the finer details. And that's how we ought to interpret prophetic writings in the Bible, and how we ought to interpret this passage first. See, in verses 1 to 8, as Daniel has this vision, it's a very realistic vision of what is going on in the world and in world history. The fearful face of earthly history. 4 beastly figures that arise from the stirring sea. And we don't have to wonder about what they are, because we're told in verse 17 that there were 4 kings or 4 kingdoms. So we don't have to wonder about what they represent. But this passage here in Daniel 7 is in fact parallel to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. There too we have 4 aspects to the statue that he sees there. 4 kingdoms that are being represented. And here, though, the focus is slightly different. There are parallels, and that helps us to understand what is going on here. But here specifically, there is a focus on the depravity and the destructiveness of these kingdoms, and ultimately how they are destroyed and replaced by God's everlasting kingdom. There in verse 4, the first beast is like a ferocious lion with eagle's wings. The wings are plucked off and the creature is lifted up. And if we compare that with a parallel section in chapter 2, it is probably representative of Nebuchadnezzar, who lost his mind for a while and then was restored. And so it's probably a picture of the Babylonian kingdom. The second beast was like a bear that raised up with a side that had still parts of what it had devoured, the ribs in its mouth. Following the Babylonian kingdom, came the Medo-Persian kingdom. And this beast, this bear, probably represents that kingdom. And the third beast was like a leopard with birds' wings on its back, more grotesque, a beast which had 4 heads and that received dominion. Again, if we look historically, the Medo-Persian kingdom was replaced by Alexander's Greek kingdom, which broke up into 4 kingdoms on his death. And then we come in verse 7 to the 4th beast, a beast which we are told again and again was different. And notice there in verse 7, up until now, the beast has always been identified with an animal from the animal kingdom. But in verse 7, there is no like. It is merely being described what is happening, terrifying and frightening, very powerful. It had large iron teeth, it crushed, devoured its victims, trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts. And 4 times in this chapter we are told that this beast was different to the preceding 3 beasts. In other words, the writer wants us to understand this beast cannot be categorized. And this is where the parallelism with chapter 2 doesn't match up. In chapter 2, the 4th beast can be identified as the Roman Empire as we look back historically. But the description here of this beast with the 10 horns and then the little horn that comes and that is different to the 10 horns seems to supersede the description of historical Rome. It seems to be so much greater. But in a sense, we don't need to identify it, because what is this whole vision that Daniel has? What is the writer trying to convey to us? The main point is not to try and understand all the finer details. The writer wants to make an impression upon you and me. He wants to scare you and me. He wants us to be terrified. Imagine Daniel in his circumstance, having this vision, and what is happening to him. He wants us to see that these are frightful creatures. He's teaching us something about the overall pattern of history. That the kingdoms of this world and the nations of this world are nations that seek to devour one another, that are out for conflict and conquest and control. They are bent on dominating and devouring. In a sense, the writer is inviting us to apply our doctrine of total depravity in the political realm, in the realm of the kingdoms of this world. And friends, perhaps it's helpful that we actually move from a general description, and remember, for Daniel, this was all predicting the future. For us, we are looking back on history and on some of these things. But perhaps we need to just dive into some history. Generalizations sometimes don't really affect us. But history provides many examples of the outworking of the beast of the kingdoms of man. It also helps to look into history to show that the age that we are living in is not unique, that it is no different to what has happened in the past. So some examples from history. In 1895 and 1896, the Turkish government troops killed 100,000 Armenians, not Armenians, Armenians. Armenians are a nation. Armenians are people who hold to a certain theological persuasion. So this is the nation. 100,000 were killed in 2 years. And then in 1915, the Turks accused the Armenians of assisting Russian invaders, and so the 24th of April 1915 was set as Armenian Liquidation Day. And on that day alone, as many as 600,000 Armenians were tortured and murdered. That is the beast of earthly government. In 1919, when the Koreans protested against the tyranny of the Japanese, men and boys had their fingers passed over red-hot wires, toenails were ripped from flesh with pincers. And then, in World War II, on Black Friday, the Japanese troops went through Alexandra Hospital in Singapore, bayoneting all patients and doctors. They tied hundreds of Chinese hands and murdered them on the beaches. And sometimes the brutality can be laid at the feet of a single dictator. And so, for instance, in 1932, Joseph Stalin demanded grain deliveries from the Ukraine, grain deliveries that exceeded the harvest of the Ukraine, and he rigorously enforced it, resulting in more than 5 million Ukrainians dying of hunger. In the 1970s, Idi Amin carried out his own unique style of carnage in Uganda, sledgehammering prisoners to death. And friends, such episodes pervade our history. And we don't have to dig very deep even to find so-called civilized, refined Western democracies guilty of similar offenses. And what verses 1 to 8 are saying to us, don't be naive about the kingdoms of this world. Don't be naive about human history. Don't be so gullible as to think that a new regime or a new ideology or a new party will instigate some form of utopia and make life better. Daniel's vision is telling us that history and the kingdoms of this world are beastly in nature. He wants us to hold a clear realism about the world that we live in. But friends, that's not all reality. That's not total reality, because Daniel reminds us that there's a different reality. The transition at verse 9 is very abrupt. And just as we are being told about this little horn that has been raised up and we expect an expansion of that, Daniel switches the scene and he says, don't look at that. Yes, that is real. But here is a greater reality, something that is far more wonderful. And in a sense, he's saying, don't be too anxious about the kingdoms of this world, the beasts of this world, the little horn. Don't worry exactly what that means. Focus on this greater heavenly reality. And even the structure of verse 9 to 14 is, in a sense, meant to highlight that, because we have 3 scenes there. We have the Ancient of Days, and then we have this little horn in the middle, and then we have one like a son of man. And it seems, even in terms of its literary structure, what Daniel is doing is he's crushing that little horn between the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, so that we can actually see how little that little horn is in reality. As I looked, thrones were set in place. The Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. What a completely different scene to the 8 verses that we've just read. Here is calmness and dignity. Here is a weightiness. All the activity of the kingdoms of this world do not affect this throne where the Ancient of Days sits. And as we think about the Ancient of Days, we mustn't look at it through the eyes of our youth-obsessed Western culture. This is a term of grandeur. This is a term of dignity. The most ancient of days, the one who is eternal. The one, not the one who simply exists for a while and then disappears off the scene like the kingdoms of this world do. But the one who is there forever. Here is a majestic person, a person with dignity and purity and majesty. Here is a person who will execute justice perfectly. And he's surrounded by innumerable hosts that acknowledge his supremacy and the splendor. Here is a picture ultimately of the day of judgment, when everything will be brought to account, when all creation is accountable to him and subject to him, and especially those mean and terrible earthly kingdoms. But alongside that, Daniel sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Who is the Son of Man? Well, friends, more than 70 times in the Old Testament, when we read about the clouds of heaven or the cloud, it refers to God, the theophany of God appearing, the presence of God being there. If you remember when Israel moved through the desert, they were guided by the cloud during the day and the pillar of fire at night. And so immediately this draws our attention to that this, although he is like the Son of Man, is not just an ordinary man. But here is one who is divine himself. Not only that, we see that all the peoples, all the nations and languages are to worship him and bow down before him. We're reminded again and again in the Bible that it is only God who is to be worshipped and who accepts worship. So here we have the divine Son of Man. And as we move into the Gospels, what is the phrase that Jesus uses to refer to himself? But this very phrase, the Son of Man. Jesus constantly speaks of himself as he takes this title for himself. And yes, for the Jews of the day, it is hidden because in one sense it can simply mean a human being, somebody who has been born of man. But as we understand Jesus' ministry, as we understand who Jesus is and what he has come to do, we realize that he actually takes the title and its full meaning upon himself. And the vision that Daniel sees is the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And when is that? Well, there are two fulfillments of that. How did Jesus ascend from earth? We are told in Acts chapter 1. that he was hidden by a cloud, and he approached, he went back into heaven on a cloud. And that is the first fulfillment of this vision. And so, in a very real sense, as Jesus has ascended back into heaven, he is reigning at present. Yes, it has a future fulfillment, that Jesus, and the angel tells us to the disciples, will come as he left. He will again come in a cloud to wrap everything up on the great day of judgment. But Jesus is the Son of Man. When the high priest illegally placed Jesus under oath and demanded to declare that he was the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, Jesus responds. He says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. See, friends, when Jesus came to earth, he proclaimed he was establishing the new kingdom, that he would establish an everlasting kingdom. As he leaves this earth in Matthew 28, he says, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. And don't we see that here? At his ascension, in Hebrews chapter 1, he sat down at the right hand of the Father. And he has been exalted to the highest place and given the name that is above every name, so that every knee should bow and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. And in John's book of Revelation chapter 5, what do we find? We find people of every tribe, tongue, and nation worshipping the Lamb and the one seated on the throne. We see the same vision there that we have here. For Daniel, this was all future. For us, part of it is in the past, and yes, there is still a future fulfillment. But friends, do you see this encouragement here for you and me? Yes, we need to be realistic. Don't have utopian hopes for this world. The beast is active. Kingdoms will always seek power. And we know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is reality. But the wonderful news is, over those kingdoms, over those kings and whoever it may be who seeks their authority, Jesus is reigning. We don't see that perfectly yet, but that doesn't mean that he is not. We embrace it by faith at the moment. See what Daniel does here as he speaks about this little horn. And we want to know, and yes, we will be told more about the little horn as we read later on in the chapter. But he stops first and he says, hang on, before we explain a little bit more about this little horn, here is something that you need to know. Something that will give you comfort, something that will give you a surety, something that will give you security, something that will give you hope in the midst of a very broken and depraved world. Jesus is in the presence of the Ancient of Days. And he reigns from there, and he has an everlasting kingdom. A kingdom that will not end. Daniel takes us behind the scenes so that we are assured heaven's kingship is firm. It won't eliminate all your struggles in life. It won't eliminate all your suffering in life. But it is certain. And one day it will be fully revealed. And this is the encouragement, or one aspect of the encouragement of the Ascension. That Jesus is presently reigning as King. That he remains active and he's involved in the world and in our lives. And all authority has been given to him. We belong to a kingdom that will never be overthrown. We belong and serve and worship a king who will reign forever. And so, friends, if you're a Christian, live out your Christianity. Be bold. Live for King Jesus in this world, a world that despises King Jesus, yes, but live for him. And do it with boldness, do it with courage. Don't look at the beasts of this world. Look to the King whose kingdom is forever, and live for him, boldly, confidently, strategically. Worship him in this world. And if there are any here this evening who do not yet know Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior, Jesus as your King, can I encourage you to find out more about Jesus, to investigate who this man is, the Son of Man who approaches and is fit to stand in the presence of the Ancient of Days, the one who is given all glory and authority and power and dominion, that you too may learn to submit to him. Because, friends, Jesus is either your Savior or he is the one who will judge you, and you too will bear his judgment, just as the beasts of the earth do. There is no in-between. The most logical and the most reasonable thing to do is to submit yourself to this good King, this King who came to earth to die for your sin, to die for my sin, who bore that penalty so that you and I don't have to face judgment, but who took the judgment upon himself. If you can top that with anything else, I heard a speaker saying fairly recently, please tell me about it because I want to embrace it. There is nothing better. There is no greater King. There is no more wonderful King than Jesus. His reign is forever. His reign is perfect. And it's a good and a loving reign. Let us rejoice in that this evening as we celebrate his ascension, his return to his rightful place at the right hand of God the Father. Amen.